Good manners, bad manners. How a manor should have been organized and how it was organized here, and the problems that ensued when the organization started to break down. That's what I'm going to be talking about. What was a manor, how it was organized, problems we've touched on before, problems on the Chase and Warren. And at a later point, the Duchy of Lancaster failed to control their officials, and there was a certain amount of local unrest and bad feeling, which we'll come to. So what is a manor? Well, that wasn't it. That was a rectory and not a manor house, despite what it's called these days. The definition that we have from one of the experts on manorial premises are that it is a residence, or it's a unit of estate administration, or a piece of landed property with tenants over whom the landlord exercised rights of jurisdiction in a private court. And it's that third definition of a manor which really concerns us. What were the rights of jurisdiction that the lord of the manor held up over the inhabitants of Aldbourne, and how was the private court run, and what happened when it fell into perhaps the wrong hands? The manor had officers. First of all, lords of the manor. They tended to be very rich, and unusually they would be, it would be unusual for them to be lord of the manor of just a single manor. Many of them had dozens of manors, so they only lived in one place or a couple of places. They weren't necessarily resident in the manors that they owned. The Duchy of Lancaster, of course, had hundreds of manors. And in each one, a steward was appointed as the Lord's representative. He may or may not have under him another official who was called various names, reeve, bailiff, or farmer. And his main occupation would be to collect the rents and the taxes, to pass those on through the steward to the lord of the manor. And here we've got reference to the reeve here in Aldbourne. This is from a document of 1560, where the people of Aldbourne reported to the officials of the Duchy of Lancaster. They say also that the reeve of the said manor, for the time being, is to gather Her Majesty's rent and to account for the same before the auditor or receiver, who hath for his pains therein as a fee 40 shillings, XLS, 40 shillings. So in Aldbourne, we had a steward, we had a reeve, and the reeve's job was to gather the rents which were due to the Queen, in this case, Queen Elizabeth, and to account for them to the auditor. And he should be paid 40 shillings for the work that he put in during the year to achieve that. Also in Aldbourne, we were a royal warren, so we had a warrener, and it was his job to manage the warren and all of the rabbits, many, many hundreds of rabbits over the area, basically between here and Liddington and Wanborough, up the either side of the B4192. Aldbourne also had a royal deer chase, and there was a keeper of the chase whose responsibility was to look after the deer and to make sure that the wood that the forest was managed properly, not so much for the production of wood and timber as for the welfare of the deer. There was a woodward who was responsible for the working timber woods and the coppices, a hayward who looked after hedges or managed the hedges and enclosures. He inspected what the individual tenants were doing and made sure that they kept their hedges and their enclosures properly. And there were a series of trading standards officer, an ale taster, a bread weigher, and a person responsible for leather and so forth. We have very little reference to these last few officials in any of the records that we found so far for Aldbourne, but there must have been such people. The manor had tenants, all of whom held their land from the lord of the manor. There was no such thing as we would know it today as a true freehold. Although you will hear sometimes people being referred to as being freeholders, they weren't in the modern sense freeholders. They were better known as free tenants. They held their land by a long-term lease for a number of years, rather than what we'll see later on. And they were known as free tenants, or sometimes tenants by indenture. And here's a document from 1509, and we can see, I need my laser pointer. Here is the beginning of a list of tenants, and they start with the liberti tenentes, the free tenants, and John York, and then William Hatt here. They are the first two of the free tenants which are listed in this document. Oh, sorry. The next level down, there are customary tenants. They held their land by copyhold, which meant that they didn't have an indenture as a lease, but what they did have was a piece of paper or perhaps parchment with a copy of the entry in the court book that recorded the fact that they'd been awarded the lease of their property. They held it by copyhold. Usually that kind of lease was based on a number of lives. The lease lasted as long as the people named in the lease were still alive. So a young man getting married and taking a first tenancy might set up his copyhold lease based on his life, his wife's life, and perhaps if he already had a child, his eldest son's life. As he died, we'll see later on, what would happen would be that as one or other of the three lives died, the tenants would go back to the court and ask for a new life to be added to the lease. And so these leases just rolled on from generation to generation. But the important thing about customary tenants, they didn't owe any service to the lord of the manor. That was where the third layer of tenant came in. Here, by the way, is the list that mentions our tenentes customarii, which are the customary tenants, Thomas Shepherd and John Hatt, and many, many others. The third level, we have the unfree tenants, people who earlier in the Middle Ages would have been known as villeins. They were still tenants, and they held their land by copyhold in the same way that the customary tenants did, but they owed service to the lord of the manor. So the lord of the manor could call on them perhaps 1 day a week or 2 days a week to work in the lord's fields, or to carry loads of wood from the coppices down to where the lord required them, either to heat his house or to for some kind of industrial use. But the unfree tenants, they had to spend some of their time working for the lord. And here we are in that same document of 1509, and they're rather uncomfortably referred to as tenentes in bondagium, tenants in bondage. Rather sinister title for them that I would have thought had died out long before that, but it appears in Aldbourne was still active at the time of Henry VIII. When a tenant died, he was required to pay a form of death duty. And that death duty that he paid to the lord of the manor was called the heriot. And we'll see at a later point how that was carried out in Aldbourne. Heriots were charged in Aldbourne. Each time that you came to the court to make a change to your copyhold lease, to take out a new one or to change a life that you were specified in the lease, there was a charge to pay. You were charged by the lord, and that was called the fine. Not quite the fine in the same sense that we use today. Fines in the sense of a punishment in those days were referred to as amercements. And you could be punished for any kind of failure. You could be punished for neglecting your property. I know of one case where a lady in Laycock had allowed her chimney to get into disrepair. And she was fined because she failed to have it repaired. You could be fined for if you were found to have done something you should not have done. The court could tell you to make the repair or scour your ditches or remove your pile of dung from the street, or all kinds of different offences that you might have taken, that you might have carried out. If you didn't correct them by a certain date, you could be amerced, and you pay an amercement as your punishment. If a man died who was the principal tenant of a copyhold lease, in some manors, the widow had the same rights as he did, as if she were still an extension of her husband. And that right, a widow's right to the property after the death of her husband, was known as jointure. Again, we'll see how that was applied in Aldbourne. It only applied in certain manors, and in each manor it was individual to the manor exactly what the terms were. The other thing which the tenancy would control the management of the common land, the amount of land that you were entitled to, and depending upon the land you were entitled to, you would be also entitled to put so many animals onto the common pasture land or into the common woods, for instance, with pigs. They would be set to graze in the woods. All of those things are handled by the courts as part of tenancies. Now, how did they relate to Aldbourne? We get a really good view of that from a survey which is dated the 10th of August, the 33rd year of Queen Elizabeth, which is 1591. And here's the document, which you might notice is in a much more recent handwriting than would have been common in 1591. This is actually a transcription that was made either in late Victorian or Edwardian times, around about 1900, 20 years or so before or after, of a document, a manuscript original, which is now lost. You see in the bottom of the screen a little note that tells us that this and this, there are two surveys in this little book, and that they come from Phillips manuscripts with these numbers. The Phillips manuscripts were manuscripts which were collected by a gentleman called Sir Thomas Phillips, who was inherited a great deal of money and spent it almost entirely on books and old manuscripts. And at the end of his life, they found that he had some 40,000 books in his library and 60,000 manuscripts. And he could never agree a price with the British government for the government to buy them from him. And so after his death, they were sold off chunk by chunk by auction. He died in 1872, and the last group of documents from his library were sold in 2006. It took 130 years to sell off all his manuscripts. And the two that relate to Aldbourne were sold at auction and have gone into private hands somewhere, and they're lost to us. So we just have these transcriptions. But they tell us, they present that the Lord of the Manor for the time being may by the custom grant any copyhold tenement within the same for 1, 2, or 3 lives in possession, and no reversion was warrantable by the custom. So it was possible that copyhold in Aldbourne could be for 1 or 2 lives, which is quite unusual. But what was normal was that the property when the final life of the series of copyhold leases expired, the reversion, what this last sentence means is the reversion goes back, the property goes back to the ownership of the Lord. The wife of any tenant within the said manor dying in possession shall enjoy the lands and tenements customary, whereof her said husband died, seized during her widowhood, living sole and chaste. So the widow was allowed to take over the lease as long as she were up until the point where she either died or remarried. If she remarried, she was no longer sole and chaste. And so that life of her husband that she was continuing was then extinguished, and something would have to be done by her children if they wanted to continue the tenancy. The heir or next of kin of any tenant dying in possession is to have the lands or tenements whereof he died possessed before any other, paying a fine at the Lord's will, etc. What this is saying is that when the chief tenant died, his heirs, who would probably already be named on the copyhold lease, were entitled without question to take over the lease and basically to add their own names to the lease to continue it to the next generation down through time. The Lord did not have the right, because one of the primary tenant had died, the Lord did not have the right to take the property back into his own ownership. So the result of this is that properties would continue down generation after generation for tens, scores, even hundreds of years. The same family would own the same piece of land within the village. There was also rules for forfeiture. Any copyholder decay his tenement, which is a great term, and not repair the same, or if he fells any great timber trees without the permission of the officers, or refuse payment of rent, then he could be held to account by the forfeit of the tenure. So this is one example where the Lord of the manor did have the right to take the property back. Now we come to the Heriot, a copyholder dying possessed of a yard land or above, written within the same manner, is to yield for Heriot his best good, quick or dead. And a tenant dying possessed of half a yard land or less is to pay for Heriot 2 shillings and 6pence. And the cottager, who has no land, no Heriot, and every freeholder there is to pay upon death for Heriot double his rent. So if one of the, here he's called a freeholder, better term would be a free tenant. He has to pay double his year's rent. That's quite a big tax. One thing that this statement points out is the use of this term, a yard land, which is quite common all the way through the medieval times as a definition of an area of land. It varied from manor to manor, and all the textbooks will tell you that a yard land is generally reckoned to be 32 acres. But we have evidence in Aldbourne that in Aldbourne it was reckoned to be 24 acres. So when we've come across yard lands, when I spoke a couple of years ago about John Southby and his the terrier, the list of his land, and that spoke of yard lands. And at that time, I didn't know exactly how much a yard land was. Now we do. It's 24 acres. The manor court would also take presentments, problems. This is where you come to, in the parish council, you come to the point where members of the public can make their complaints to the parish council and expect to have some kind of redress on either on the council or on some other villager. And so we would have presentments, and this same document, this same survey notes that there were problems with the tenants of Ogbourne, sorry. Oh, let's go back. That the inhabitants of Ogbourne have taken into their use a piece of ground called Cockshoot of 3 acres. And that really belongs to the manor of Ogbourne, and it's where people used to pasture sheep and cattle. So the people of Ogbourne are complaining that Ogbourne has stolen some of their land. Rights of way. This is one we'll hear about again. They present that Thomas Walrond denies Her Majesty's tenants of the manor of their usual way through the backside of the farm. They're claiming that Mr. Walrond has closed up a public right of way through his farm. That's a problem that still occurs to this day. Encroachments. They complain that Christopher Burrell has encroached on the highway because he's set up a fence and planted some trees along the front of his house, much to the annoyance and hindrance of the passage of carriages along the highway. So that's something that the lord of the manor, or probably his steward, will have to sort out. Neglected, misused woodlands. Somebody's been cutting down too many trees. Somebody's felled trees in the Sandwich and Hart's Hook woods by the order of somebody called Richard Inkpen. 130 trees have been felled, but nobody knows who gave the authority. So another problem for the steward to sort out. There might also be tenancy disputes, whether or not somebody owned a piece of land in the common fields or had the use of a piece of land in the common fields, and his neighbor was taking it over. All kinds of local issues like that would be handled by the court. Another interesting thing in this same document, remember this is from 1590, and there's this note: there are within the said manor 2 yearly fairs, one on St. Edward's Day, which is now lost, and Mary Magdalene's Day, which is still the day of the Ogbourne feast. The profits whereof do appertain unto the bailiff for the consideration of yearly rent of 10 shillings. And also that there hath been a weekly Tuesday market kept in the town of Ogbourne until 10 years now last past, and sit hence the same is and hath been discontinued. So the market, for which the market cross was erected back perhaps in the 14th century, that had ceased to exist in the 1580s, sometime in the last 10 years before 1590. There's evidence that the market actually started up again a little later, but only lasted a few more years again after that. Finally, this same survey includes a complete perambulation of the manor, which we'll see is more or less coincident with the parish, and it's just like our beating the bounds. I'll go through it because it introduces some names of places which we know, and also names of places that we don't. So that as they think, the same most aptly beginneth on the southeast part of the said manor, at a parcel of ground called Duck Lane. Duck Lane, hang on, I'm going to have to move that over there. I've got Zoom is covering up part of my screen. Piece of ground called Duck Lane, which we know as South Street. From thence to a waste plot of ground at the north end of Lord's Meadow, which we know as Palmer's Field, compassing the same plot, and so overthwart the way into Lord's Mead, following the east hedge to the south field, southeast of the brook, to the nether part thereof, which divided us from Ramsbury, which means they've gone down to Preston, and following the said brook to the lower end of Galley Close, which is Preston, from which close south to Miller Edge Coppice Hedge. Don't know Miller Edge. Yes, I've been forgetting to do these. Miller Edge Coppice. To Lover's Lane. It's a name we know, although we've dropped the R out of lover these days. To Latimer Coppice, and so forth, as the same hedge leadeth to Pole's Close. Does anybody know where Pole's Close would be? And then from thence leading by the same hedge to Sondrich Yat, along by Mush's Hedge to Mush's Lane. Well, Mush's is at the far end of Ewins Hill Lane. And so thence along to White's Hard Bottom, and so along the ditches to Yeldene, which we perhaps remember as Cheldene, near Wood's End. Thence along the ditch that leadeth to Motterley Croft and to Snap Common. Oh, I missed Moor's End Lane. To Motterley Croft and Snap Common, and thence to Badbury Mere. Now, mere in this, you might know mere as meaning a lake. It doesn't mean a mere here. It refers to a mere stone, which were the stones that were placed at the various points around the boundary of a manor. They were called mere stones. These are the famous stones on which little boys used to be bounced, would be bounced at each of the mere stones around around the parish or around the manor. From thence along the ditch to Sugar Way, which is still in use, and hence to the mere stone, again a mere stone at the top of Lodge Hill. So we're up along the Swindon edge of the ridge, the Four Barrows Ridge, as it goes over to the other valley. From which mere stone along a ditch to the Lord's Plot, and eastward to Ricketts Cross, which is up on the top road at Baden. Along by Eastleigh's Hedge, Eastleigh's we know, to White Pits, White Ponds these days, and thence by a lynch and way that leadeth to Sir William's Cross. I've never heard reference to Sir William's Cross. I'd be very interested to hear if anybody knows anything about Sir William's Cross. And from the said cross along the mere, this suggests that there actually was a cross there, which divideth this manor of Baden to Red Dean. And then it goes to Crockbush, and finally down through Ford's Lane to Ford Farm and Duck Lane, back on through South Street. So that's followed the, I'm not kept up with the itinerary, I'm afraid. That's basically taken us round the circuit of the manor in the opposite direction to the way that our beating the bounds goes these days. We've gone clockwise around the manor rather than anti-clockwise. Now, how many of these surveys of the manor are there? The ones which I found are 1509, and there's a page of it, pretty splendid document that we have on view actually in the center, or a copy of it. There's another one from 1552 which contains the list of tenants and rents. That's the first survey which is in this transcript of the lost documents. 1560, there's the survey, what's called the Survey of the Boundaries and Game of the Manor and Chase of Aldbourne. And this I've talked about some years ago. This is a case where the Queen is complaining that the Goddard, the Waldron and Goddard families are hunting in her chase. And she held there was an inquiry held at Dudmore Lodge in 1560 to look into the case. And as I say, I gave a talk about that some 3 or 4 years ago. 1591 is the second of the transcripts that we have, and that's got all the list of the tenants and their rents, but also the perambulation and the details that we've been through of the customs and the presentments and so forth. It's a much more thorough document. In 1603, James I came to the throne of England, James I and 6th of Scotland, and he ordered a survey of all of his manors, and that was done by a man called Norden. And Norden's survey is quite a famous national document. But the entry for Aldbourne, we actually have 2 contemporary copies of that document. And that again has a list of the tenants and rents and details of the customs and some presentments. 1613, we've got another one. Tenants and rents of the manor. And there is the document. It's much harder to read than any of the others. So I've left it and have not yet transcribed it, but I was getting a bit nervous this afternoon, thinking about giving this presentation this evening. And so to take my mind off things for an hour or so, I had a go at the first few lines of it, and I can confirm that it really is jolly difficult to read. And in 1659, there's another survey, but this is a survey only of the chase itself. And that confirms that the chase was just under 1,500 acres and that it housed about 400 fallow deer. But now, 1659, just after the Civil War, they've all gone. They've all been hunted and killed, and there are no more deer left in the chase. I suspect the citizens of Aldbourne were all going around having had to slightly let their belts out from the good feeding that they'd had for a few years during the Civil War. 1607 again, we've got this. This was a running dispute, a running sore. 1607, illegal hunting in the chase. We've got this wonderful map. It's on view in the center. I've talked about it before. So apart from mentioning that there were problems with hunting in the chase in 1607, I'm not going to talk any more about that at the moment. So we've had the 1560 and 1607. And then again in 1635, there's yet another reference which I've just found quite recently, that comes from the Calendar of State Papers from 1635. And it's referring to a case which has come up that day, 16th of October, 1635, in the Court of Star Chamber for hunting in the King's Chase called Aldbourne Chase. And it's been brought by a gentleman called Bond, who was Lord of the Manor at the time. This is after the point where the manor has been passed to the City of London. And he's brought a case against the Goddard family for hunting in the King's Chase. And the result of that, William Goddard Sr. and William Goddard Jr. were found guilty, and they were fined £500 each with bonds for good behaviour. Now, £500 fine in 1635 is an enormous amount of money. So that's a really, really heavy fine on the Goddards. The Goddards, mind you, were an extremely rich family who'd made a lot of money out of the wool trade. And by this time owned also the manor of Swindon and lots and lots of property all around. And I know we've got one of the Goddards with us tonight. Hello, Millie.
Hi. I'm sure. I'm pretty sure that we only hunted because nobody else was doing it, and it seemed like the right thing to do.
Oh, we'll see. Anyway, the two men were fined £500 each, but Elizabeth Goddard, who was the wife of William Sr., who'd also been with them, she wasn't fined at all. She was let off free. So that was one part of hunting, was one of the areas that caused a great deal of friction between the lords of the manor and the tenants. What we come to now is a matter of friction between the tenants and the Lord Steward. And in 1600, an inquiry is called by Queen Elizabeth into the problem. And so here we are. Here is this bundle of documents in the National Archives. This is the first one. The first page is the commission by Queen Elizabeth or by one of her officials of the Duchy of Lancaster on her behalf to call an inquiry. And it starts, Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, to our trusty and well-beloved Edward Moore, Esquire, surveyor for the possessions of our Duchy of Lancaster for the south part, Henry Sadleir, John Warnford, Esquire, and William Jones, gentlemen. Those four men are to carry out an inquiry into the case between Thomas Pearce, Thomas Adey, and others, plaintiffs, they are the tenants of Aldbourne, against Edward Waldron and Roger Waldron, defendants. Edward Waldron was he is called the bailiff, which at this stage of the life of the manor appears to be different from the reeve, but they were basically running the manor at that time. And it was given at our said palace under the seal of said duchy on the 22nd day of April in the 42nd year of our reign, 1600. And the next document in the bundle is the list of questions that Thomas Pearce and Thomas Adey want people to give witness to. And so the witnesses that they're calling on their behalf are going to be asked, do you know the plaintiffs, and if so, how long? Have tenants been admitted to copyhold leases for reasonable rent? Were any denied admittance before Edward Waldron was farmer? Does Edward Waldron demand excessive fines from Pearce and Adey for admittance? Do you know of others who have received such demands? So is Edward Waldron now taking the position of steward? And is he demanding excessive amounts of money when Pearce and Adey have come to change their copyhold leases, which we'll remember from some of the earlier slides that we've seen, was normally 2 years' rent. Is he charging something more excessive than that? Before Edward Waldron was farmer, were tenants usually charged 2 years' rent as a fine? They'll be asked to confirm that. Have you heard of him demanding 14 years' rent? Does Edward Waldron keep more conies than earlier? Do they cause damage to tenants' property? Do they strip the common land of pasture? So Edward Waldron is allowing the rabbits to run out of control to the detriment of the tenants. Is this true? Was there always a reeve elected by the homage who was responsible for collecting rents and preparing the accounts for the Queen? They're claiming that Edward Waldron no longer allows a reeve, and so they have no jurisdiction, no say over the rents and accounts. Does Edward Waldron refuse to allow or pay for a reeve? Do you know Henry Martin? Was he appointed steward of the manor by Edward Waldron? So it's very difficult to know exactly what position Edward Waldron appears to have gathered around himself. Was he appointed steward of the manor by Edward Waldron? And is he married to Waldron's kinswoman? Is he keeping it all in the family? Does Waldron ignore tenants' requests to maintain the common lands? Has Roger Waldron flooded Dark's Lane, so hindering the other tenants? Has Roger Waldron recently blocked a path through his farm? You remember we read about that earlier on. And finally, do the greater number of conies now force tenants to make more hedges? So the rabbits are a real problem, it seems, for people. And anyway, then we come to the next part of this bundle, which are the depositions of the various witnesses, taken the 20th of May in 1600. And so here are the witnesses who are called. There's John Dixon, and just like modern day journalists, they have to say how old these people are. So John Knight is 36, Thomas Smith, alias Wheeler, he's more than 70, but he's a mere chicken compared to William Mudge, who claims to be 100 years old. Humphrey Simpson, 70. Edward Coleman, William Lawrence, Thomas Fowler, Robert Morley, John Hyatt, Thomas Collins, and George Adams. That's George Adams from Ford Farm. There's another family that I've talked about in earlier talks. But those are all the witnesses which are called on behalf of the plaintiffs. And what they all say is, well, they all agree that the fine used to be 2 years' rent. And only one of them testifies that yes, since Sir John Point was steward, there have been cases where copyholds have been denied that shouldn't have been denied. Several testify that they know of people who've been charged excessive fines, and the people that they quote as having received those charges, Thomas Collins and Robert Evanswich. Excuse me. Two people agree that yes, they do know of somebody who's been charged 14 years rent as his fine. Everybody agrees that the rabbits are a real problem and they need more hedges. And they all agree that the reeve used to be elected, but Edward Waldron refuses to allow one to be elected. Nobody testifies that anything important has been refused, but they all agree that Dark's Lane and the path through Roger Waldron's farm have all been blocked. Then we come to the questions from the other side. These are the questions that are going to be asked of the witnesses for Edward and Roger Walrond. It's interesting to note that all of the questions for the plaintiffs refer to them as Edward and Roger Waldron, W-A-L-D-R-O-N, and yet this set of questions from the Walrons themselves refers to them as Walrond. Looks almost as though there are two different factions within the village as to how that name should be spelt. Does Edward Walron have the right to issue copyholds and hold courts? Did the farmer always have the fines, or were they fixed or at his discretion? Has Edward Walron exacted excessive fines, or has he treated the tenants well? Do you know of the sale of a copyhold by Collins to Thomas Burwell? Well, actually, that sale was the other way around. Despite what it says in this list, it was actually Burwell's sold it to Collins. What did Collins pay to Edward Walrond for the change of lease? Are there more cronies than before? Are there new boroughs, and do they do more damage than before? Did the Walrons agree with the tenants that Thomas Preston be given 2 acres to build his house, which he enjoyed rent-free for life? I don't know where that's come from, because I don't think anybody's complained about that. But perhaps they're just trying to show what really nice people the Walrons are. What fines do you know that were for 2 years or more rent? So back to that question again. Has the Reeve of Aldbourne always had an allowance of 40 shillings a year? How much rent does Edward Walrond collect from the tenants each year, and how much does he pay to the Queen? Did Henry Martin ever reject a presentment from the homage? Did Roger Walrond stop up the watercourse in Dark Lane and hinder tenants? Has Roger Waldron blocked his path through his farm? Did Roger Walrond expel other tenants from land in Stock Lane? That's back to number 8 again, this business of the land that he gave Thomas Preston, which, as far as I can see, nobody complained about anyway. And here is the list of their depositions, what they all said in answer to those questions. The depositions of the witnesses taken the 21 and 20th day of May. And here are the witnesses that they call: John Bright, William Gardner, Henry Martin. Henry Martin, well, he's one of the people that's accused. George White, John Hunt, Thomas Walrand, member of the family, John Sexton, Thomas Coleman, Thomas Collins, Richard Belly, George Mills, Thomas Fowler, William Cook, Stephen Barley, Thomas Smith alias Wheeler, who also was called by the other lot, and Thomas Sparrow. Now, quite a few of those are actually employed by the Walrand family, and some of the others also have other links to the family. So it's not quite such an unbiased group of witnesses as you might expect, but they do tell us something really telling. The first three agree that Edward Walrand and Sir John Point have the rights and claim they don't charge excessively. But they say they don't charge excessively. They never charge anything more than 5, 6, or 8 years rent, which sounds like fairly excessive to me. 4 witnesses claim that there are fewer rabbits and less damage. But then you look into who the 4 witnesses are, and you find that 3 of them are actually employed by the Waldron family to run the warren. And so they're actually responsible for the rabbits, but they claim that there are fewer, which doesn't quite add up with what everybody else says. Several agree that the lanes are flooded or locked, but say that the fact that people can't use them anymore is not a hindrance. But the main crux is the list of copyhold fines that they swear to as examples of fines which are not excessive. Here is the list. Robert Scory. His property has a rent of 33 shillings a year. He was charged £13 6 and 8 pence, which is 8 times his rent. Thomas Collins. His rent is 10 shillings a year, and he was charged £7, which is indeed 14 times his rent. Thomas Pierce, despite the way it's spelt. His rent is 25 shillings and the fine £12. That's 9 times his rent. Widow Harris, rent 18 shillings, and she was fined £10, which is 11 times her rent. Thomas Fowler, 6 times his rent. Stephen Barley, 11 times his rent. And the one who's got off lightest of all, Thomas Smith, rent 25 shillings, fined £5, which is a factor of 4. So every single one of those that they give as an example of not being an excessive rent is way over what had been the normal 2 years rent. It's fairly clear, and it was fairly clear to the officers who were making the inquiry, that the Walrand family were profiteering from the hold that they had over the running of the manor. Unfortunately, the way that things are maintained or are filed at the and indexed at the National Archives means that I've not been able to find the document that gives the final report of the commissioners into what they thought should be done in Holborn as a result of this inquiry. But it's fairly clear that it did ring some fairly heavy alarm bells, because a few years later, there's another survey, 1603. At the end of this 1603, this is the survey by Norden that we spoke about and we looked at a little bit of earlier. Right at the end, he concludes with this section. which says it's titled "The Bailey Unduly Chosen and His Corrupted Fees," and you'll notice that we have these little pointing hands, which was the way in documents through medieval times right on into the 18th century of pointing out paragraphs which are important. So it's much like we might put a big exclamation mark in red marker beside important paragraphs today. These are important. And this says, "The bailey is commonly chosen amongst the customary tenants, who takes up the waifs and strays, and hath all felons' goods under 40 shillings, and half of it be above." So not only was the bailey taking the fees from within from the tenants of the manor, he also exacted fees and fines from any waifs and strays, and also confiscated goods of criminals who came by. And it goes on to say, it hasn't marked this as being particularly important, but it goes on to say, "The choice of this officer, the bailey, appertaineth not unto the tenants, howsoever they may prescribe, but to the prince, whose officer he is. And as touching his pretence of having felons' goods in form aforesaid, is a mere usurpation and wrong to the prince, and by no means tolerable, for by this means he seems quarter lord of the royalty." So Mr. Waldron is quite wrong in claiming all of these rights and claiming the various monies to be his. They belong to the prince. He also receives the rents and makes provision for the auditors, and besides the former usurped fees, hath 40 shillings, XL shillings per annum, so that every man strives to have the office. It's good to be the officer because you make a lot of money, at least the way that Mr. Walrond runs it. And it finally goes on to say, "What provision should be made for the auditors in that place, in Holborn, I think in reason should be easily done." In other words, it shouldn't be difficult to sort out the problem. "But that the auditors of the Duchy of Lancaster in former times have had an aspiring power," which I think means have been really weak, "and what they had or did was seldom controlled." And it finally goes on to say, "It is requisite it should be otherwise in future." In other words, enough of the corruption that's been going on in the village, in the manor. It remains to be seen whether or not it did become otherwise in future, but that will be for a lot more research and for another talk. That's all I have for you tonight.
Let me put a slightly different slant on the Waldrons. I have no brief for the Waldrons, especially as one of the plaintiffs was almost certainly the ancestor of mine, William Jones, the landowner and big purchaser of manors from Manors. Now, this period is one when agricultural prices and profits are going up. And it's difficult to say that the Waldrons are being unreasonable if they're pushing the fines up in order to get what they might have considered a fair share of the increased take from agriculture at this time. So in other words, you could turn the argument on its head and say that despite my putative ancestors' grievances, anybody who's going to have to pay more is going to be aggrieved. Whether they should pay more or not is not the question, but I suggest there's an alternative possibility. But it's jolly good talk, so thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think there's some question about the variability of the level of fines that they were issuing, which even varying between 4 times and 14 times. It does rather look as though there were people that they there's a certain amount of favoritism maybe going on, or undue.
Well, it may be, but you'd have to know what the land was and its capabilities were, and
True.
what type of farming was going on, which I think no records will be detailed enough ever to tell us.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair comment. Questions? Terry?
Yeah. Do we know which house in the village was the manor house? The reason I ask that is because at the end of the 17th century, Elizabeth Bond sold what we now know as the courthouse to the Core family for their bell foundry. Just wonder if it was the same place.
Almost certainly, yes. You notice that in the record from the case in Star Chamber was Bond versus Goddard. Bond at that time was Lord of the Manor. And yes, the records show that the Bond family ended up through to Elizabeth Bond, who sold the courthouse to the Core family. So almost certainly, yes, the Bonds were lived in courthouse, which would have therefore been the manor house.
John,
Karen. Oh, sorry. So another hand first. Sorry, Karen.
Have you come across any of the Lydiards in any of the early 1600 surveys? I've not. I'm actually, as you know, I'm actually looking through all the manor records every time I go there. I've actually been concentrating on those held in Ogbourne and the Deans of Windsor, because I'm hoping to get the link between the Lydiards of Ogbourne and the Lydiards of Ogbourne, which we know exists. So has there been any mention of the Lydiards in the early 1600s at all that you've come across?
I've come across one, but he was from Ogbourne.
Of course he was. But was he in Ogbourne at the time? We know that the Ogbourne
no, he was one of the
Lydiards are one and the same family. So
he was one of the people who were involved in taking the land at the far western edge of the chase.
Okay, what year was that? Do we know?
I'm not sure I can tell you off the top of my head.
Okay.
But
okay.
we're talking about that period, the 1580s.
Okay.
Leading up to that came up in the 1590 survey that was happening. So yeah, it's that period.
All right, I'll have to dig out that document next time I'm over there.
I'll dig out the reference that I found and let you have it.
Oh, thank you.
Somebody else, Liz tried to answer.
I was just wondering, obviously one of those cases was in the Star Chamber. Was the courthouse actually functioning as a court then? Would some of the other cases actually be held in the courthouse in Ogbourne?
None of the surveys that we have actually mention where they were taking place. They may well have been taking place in the courthouse. The only one which does mention it is the inquiry in 1560 into the illegal hunting in the chase by the Waldron family. And that took place at Dudmore Lodge. That's actually quoted as held at Dudmore Lodge. So the others simply don't say where they're being held. Millie.
Does that mean then that the house where the Lord of the Manor resided changed? So if was he in the courthouse sometimes at Upper Upham?
Basically, the manor house is the house where the Lord of the Manor or the Lord or his steward lives.
So it could easily change as the lordship changed.
Yes, now it's of course down West Street.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So, but it was never what's now called the manor, the old manor. That was always the rectory or the parsonage, and was the seat of the rector of Aldbourne, who was a civil, a lay rector on behalf of the dean and chapter of Winchester. And that's another talk, why Aldbourne was split between Winchester and Salisbury. Ecclesiastically, it's Salisbury, but most of the tithe actually went to Winchester. So another talk sometime. That'll need a trip to the Hampshire Record Office where they've got all the records about that.
I'm actually going to Cambridge and Windsor Castle, actually. So if there's any reference to Aldbourne, I'll be sure to. Yeah, that's. I'm spending a week in Cambridge University to actually looking at the manor records, and also Windsor Castle to have a look at some of those records as well.
Yeah.
There was obviously a dispute, a long-standing dispute between Ogbourne. The Lord of the Manor was King's College, Cambridge.
Yes. Yep.
And the Aldbourne Manor, as to exactly where the boundary lay between them, and that went on for some time. So you should find lots of references to Prior's Wood and the disputes about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there'll be a lot in Cambridge. When I was studying medieval Aldbourne, some of the footnotes did say that the records were kept in Cambridge. So it's somewhere where I've always wanted to go and have a look. I think you'll find a lot there.
The King's College records are online, I believe. So if anyone wants to look them up, they can be saved a trip to Cambridge.
Not all of them. Not all of them. I've actually been in touch with them. I've got those that are online, but not all of them are.
Oh. So Aldbourne's missing, is that the problem?
So only some. I'm actually I'm concentrating on Ogbourne, but obviously if there's Aldbourne records there, I'll be there, because it's my aim at some stage in my life to actually prove the descent. We know that they are, the Lydiards of Aldbourne are a direct descendants of those of Ogbourne, but I actually want the paper proof. So, and because the parish records are missing, manor records are my only hope that we're going to find it. So.
What about the Reverend Landlords and his Tenants book, the progress of the Dean and Chapter of Winchester immediately after the Civil War? If Winchester owned rights and land in Aldbourne, Aldbourne should show up in that. Yes,
I don't know if I'll get there. It's on the list. I'm only there for 6 weeks, so we'll see what happens.
No, but this will be in Winchester, Hampshire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Howard. Warwick, sorry.
You're muted.
Thank you. Very good talk, John. When the Lord of the Manor held a court to judge on some misdemeanor, did he sit on his own and was he judge and jury? Was there anyone else?
That was on a slide that I cut out of my my talk because it was going to take too long.
Sorry.
The court normally, the court was formed by the steward, occasionally with the lord of the manor, but sitting with the steward would be a jury of normally 12 local tenants who are called the homage, and they sat. Sorry, I'm looking. They were also part of the court, so it helped make decisions. It's hard to tell from the records that we have, at least the records that I've seen, whether the Lord actually acted as a dictator or whether the court was a more democratic organization. Do you have any idea on that, Eric?
I don't think you can tell from
No, exactly.
those sorts of records. I would think the only possibility is to examine a number of similar parishes which had inquiries of the same sort, but I think that would last more than your lifetime and certainly more than mine.
Yes, I've been through several, well, just over 100 years worth of the Laycock court roll, and it's not clear from that. The homage certainly present their presentments to the Lord, but it's not clear whether they have any say in the outcome of the deliberations. Are there any more questions?
Yes, John, can you hear me?
Who's this?
Ray.
Ray.
Right. Got a question for you, John.
Yeah.
In the parish, how many customary tenants were there then in the parish of Albourne, do you think?
I've never actually counted, but there are a lot.
Right. Right. And how did you become one?
100.
How did you? 100?
Yeah,
Okay.
certainly into the more than 100 in some of the surveys.
Okay. Okay. And how easy was it to become one?
And how would you become a customary tenant when a property became available?
Okay.
You would go to the court.
Put in your request. Yes. Okay.
And request to be allowed to take a certain property. That certainly was clear in some of the Laycock records that I transcribed. They all start with Fred Bloggs came to the court. To this court came Fred Bloggs and requested whichever property it was. From time to time, we get situations like we saw in our presentation here of the land. What was his name? Preston. The 3 acres over by Stock Close,
Right.
where the Lord of the Manor or the bailiff had allowed this man to build a house on the manor wasteland. In other words, land that's not being used for arable farming or for woodland or for pasture. And again, my knowledge of Laycock knows that from time to time people would be allowed to build a new house on wasteland within the parish, and that would then be let to them on a copyhold basis. So
Right.
that's how you became a copyholder.
Okay. Do you think people always
Warwick again.
Did you become an ale taster?
Well,
Good
that
people.
They all were.
at one of the courts each year, they would elect the ale taster and constables as well. Some places would have constables, and in a village like Aldbourne, I've not found any reference to it. But Upham, being a hamlet outside the village, would have had what was called a tithing man. And he would have been the representative of the people who lived in that hamlet. At Laycock, again, there was a tithing called Notton, which is down by the bridge just outside Laycock. So the tithing man of Notton would go as part of the court.
Mhm.
Right.
Thank you.
A splendid lot of questions.